each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the Guyanese public at home and in the diaspora. And one of the most shocking issues which are current today in Guyana is the issue of domestic violence. And the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actually said violence against women and girls may be the world's longest and deadliest pandemic. That is the comment he made on violence against women and girls in the world at large. But in Guyana, the situation is very dire. Every week, a woman is killed in Guyana, murdered in Guyana, usually by her partner or spouse. Yes, in the first 39 weeks of this year, 2023, there have been 39 violent killings. And when you look at the record of other forms of violence in Guyana, the civil violence, the cultural violence, domestic violence, emotional violence, frontier violence, especially Venezuela, gang violence, police violence against citizens, school violence, sexual violence, and verbal violence, such as we had at Babujan, that verbal violence. This shows that there are various forms of violence, and shamefully, and as a Guyanese, I say shamefully, it seems that violence is becoming endemic in society. Domestic violence occurs at a relatively high rate in the world and in Guyana. About 1 out of every 2 women in the 15 to 60 years age group have been or are experiencing abuse by their partners or spouses at some time or other. Yes, 55% of Guyanese women are exposed to violence. This is a rate that is higher than the world average, which is about 1 out of every 3. Here in Guyana, we're talking about 1 out of every 2 women having been exposed to violence. And you can see it is not the way that we can build a cohesive state, not the way we can build a community in which we like our children to grow up. There's nothing good about domestic violence. And when we speak of domestic violence, we speak about interpersonal violence. People call it IPV, or intimate partner violence, another form of IPV. But women are affected from every race, from every region, from every religion, from every rank in society. This is not a matter for poor people. This is not a matter for Armenians or Africans or Indians alone. Women of every race, from every region of the country, from every religion, and every rank in society have been affected by domestic violence. Let us look at the record for 2023. A part of the record, I can't go through all 39 murders of women. But starting in January, a fisherman hacked his wife to death. A woman was chopped and left to die in a canal, both in January. A woman was stabbed to death for trying to leave her husband, who was abusive, in March. The same month, a woman's battered body was found. A woman's body was found, the head almost totally cut off in April. A woman was shot in her head in May. A woman was shot to death in August. A woman was beaten to death by her husband following an argument over $500 Guyana. Beaten to death over an argument of $500 Guyana. A woman was stabbed to death in September. Sometimes these issues may seem to the outsiders to be frivolous or trivial, what caused these killings? And why can't we bring it to a some conclusion? If we know the killings are taking place, what can be done to stop the killings of particularly the women? Domestic violence in the first half of 2023 recorded a surge in killing. Today I'm dealing mostly with killings, but the reports are nearly 3 times higher than the same period last year. So things are getting worse. And even if you look at just the reports of violence, not only deaths, domestic killings constituted the most prevalent category of killings in the first half of 2023. Between 1st of January 29th of June or 1st of July, there were 33 killings. And as I said earlier, there are 39 killings for the entire year so far. At the rate we are going, my friends, it is quite likely that by the 31st of December, at least 52 women would have been killed. And these are women who are between the ages of 15, they're girls really, and 60. So we can't go on like this, killing one woman every week in this country. And when we look at the reports, the killings are bad, terrible. But there are lots of reports. And bear in mind that some persons don't even bother to report domestic violence. Reports have been increasing annually. They have not been decreasing. They're not under control. They're increasing. In 2020, the year this administration entered office, 1,672 reports. By the following year, there were 1,896 reports. By last year, 2022, there were 2,017 reports. And so far, at least up to September 2023, there have been 2,231 reports. Where does this violence come from? When you look back at the troubles in the first decade of this millennium, particularly during 2005 to 2014, there was an average of 10 reports of domestic violence a day. In fact, during that period, there were nearly 40,000 reports of domestic violence. Yes, the tragic truth is that Guyana has become or is becoming a violent society, particularly in the way we treat our women and girl children. What causes violence? The United Nations says that domestic violence is, and let me quote from the United Nations Convention, a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or to maintain power and control over an intimate partner. So what we find is that within a household, children who are exposed to, or children who themselves experience violence, domestic violence particularly, may grow up feeling that this is the way to deal with disputes. If there is a quarrel, well then resort to violence to bring the quarrel to an end. So people fall in love with violent means of settling disputes. There's a saying that, when the only tool that a man has is a hammer, every problem he has looks like a nail, So he or she doesn't have a means of reasoning and compromising and reaching agreement. So a lot of people have hammers, and every problem they have, they treat as a nail, something that's to be hammered. Traditionally, in Guyana, the little bit of domestic violence research, with which I am familiar, there may be more, I don't know. I can't know everything. But Research seems to feel that violence is framed around the power imbalance between couples or within groups. So violent relationships are complex, whether at home, at school, or in the street. Somebody wants power, somebody wants control. But many underlying factors could contribute to the incidence of violence. And these include, of course, exposure to violence as a child. So when a child grows up seeing daddy beating mommy, and he himself later on has a partner or a spouse, a wife of his own, he feels that it's okay because daddy did it, no, I'm doing it. And this creates a continuum. In addition to that, children who themselves are treated violently and experience some form of trauma, um, and also those who embrace cultural customs about superiority. They may belong to some, or they may share some way of thinking which says that women are inferior and they should be beaten, you know, spare their rod and spoil the child. Some people believe that is the way to treat wives, you know, with violence. And when people have those thoughts embedded in their minds, you know, throughout their lives, it's hard for them to change. It's hard for them to sit down at the table and reason and treat their spouses as equals. So it starts at childhood. And the exposure of a child to violence or the experience of a child if it's violent and embracing these cultural conventions, you know, could also lead to violence. You know. If you feel that culturally males are superior to females, this is likely to transmit or likely to take the form of control mechanisms within the family, within the school, in the street. So sometimes you see school violence, sometimes you see gang violence. All of these forms of violence emerge because of the feeling that violence could be used to control other persons. But I would say that other forms of research, and this is a matter that we shouldn't just guess about. There should be some form of research into the causes of violence in Guyana. And it shows that the research shows that the virulence of violence, um, uh, especially during the disturbances of the mid 1960s and during the troubles of the early 2000s, had an immediate and secondary impact on society. There was an immediate impact. People get killed. But years after, there's a secondary impact. The persons who witnessed that violence, or the persons who were victims of violence, or the persons whose relatives were affected by the violence, see violence as a path to political power and control, or maybe even as a path to revenge. So when acts of violence are committed, like during the Troubles, when there were so many massacres, we should not feel that that's the end of the story, particularly when we know that the massacres and the murders were never thoroughly investigated by the government of the day, which is the People's Progressive Party Civic. So we had a dozen massacres at Lusignan, at Lindo Creek, at Bartica, um, all over the country. And we put up monuments, but the monuments don't solve the problem because at the time that they occurred, they were never investigated. And as one senior police officer announced, all of the witnesses have been killed. So the problems persist, and they would probably remain, the murders would probably remain unsolved. Now, when we look at the legacy of the troubles, when we look at what has taken place in Guyana over the last 25 years, much less going over the last 50 or 60 years, because next year will be the 60th anniversary of the disturbances of 1964. And I can tell you that the disturbances still cast a dark shadow over Guyanese history. So we can continue to examine causation. What causes violence? And how can we try to eradicate violence? Apart from the legacy of the troubles and the disturbances, it is true that some victims of violence are disinclined to report that violence to the police or even to senior members of their family. And they try to keep this as a family secret. Or sometimes they even choose to settle the matters out of court um, rather than make a big hullabaloo about it. Sometimes they are indecisive. Um, the victims are indecisive about resolving disputes because they feel that the law enforcement agencies are insensitive, especially in some small communities. When you go to the closest police station, it is quite likely that the policemen know the family and know both the victim and the assailant, and they feel they may not get um, proper treatment or justice, especially if the assailant is known to the policeman. And the Red Thread organization, which has done a tremendous amount of research into domestic violence, uh, produced some years ago a report called a Universal Periodic Review of women and children in Guyana. And they reported the perception that it was a perception, this may not be a fact. Red Thread reported a perception that corrupt policemen could be bribed to suppress domestic violence complaints. And there again, you can see the frustration of a victim, of particularly a woman, who is reluctant to make a complaint because they feel the policeman's being bribed to suppress the complaint, and it goes no further. In fact, when she goes home and her husband accuses her of going to the police, the violence would be more intense than before. We know very well that there is legislation against domestic violence, which gives women the right to seek protection and allows victims to seek orders, tenancy orders from a magistrate. But sometimes they argue, if I complain against an abusive spouse or husband, where am I going to live? How am I going to get food? I haven't been working. Who's going to look after my children? So after a while, it is possible that many of them accept the abusive relationship as being the best of a bad situation. And worse still, I know recently there's been an announcement that the domestic violence laws will be revised, but the penalties for violation of protection orders, for example, are laughably light. Um, 10,000 Guyana dollars. I mean, some of the assailants probably work for more than that in a day. So going to court and paying the fine is not a problem for them, and they continue their abusive ways. Um, and sometimes the laws are not rigorously enforced because the complaint may stop dead in its track at the level of the police station for one reason or the other. My friends, we know that the law exists, particularly for um, protecting victims of domestic violence. And we know that the police force has constructed or modified some of its stations so that there's a private room where victims of violence could uh, give evidence confidentially without being exposed to the open courtroom. And similarly, magistrates' courts now have specially equipped rooms to facilitate the recording of evidence and the concealment of the images and um, of victims, so it doesn't become a news sensation. But these are necessary, yes. I think the identity of the victims must be protected, but they're not sufficient to curb, well, because many victims have to go back to violent situations at home. So although there have been efforts at level of the police and the courts and um, criminal justice system, they are not enough. When we're talking about curbing domestic violence or eradicating domestic violence, we need to have a plan, a national action plan. We need to employ sound approaches to real problems in Guyana. We don't want to just cherry pick articles from what is happening in Finland or Denmark. We want people to study the situation in Guyana, in the villages and in the hinterland, particularly, so that we can come up with a plan that works. And I would suggest on this program that that plan be built, that plan be erected on 5 pillars. First, there must be the promotion of social cohesion by mainstreaming policies which meet the special needs of women and girls. The equality doesn't come easy, and it's no point, just talking about, corridor of unity and one Guyana. We need to understand that there is no foundation for social cohesion. And social cohesion, if it is properly implemented, if it's properly understood, must treat other ethnic groups and the other gender, in the case of male to female or female to male, as equal. The question of equality is central to social cohesion. And domination is the opposite of equality. Domination is the opposite of social cohesion. Second, there must be participation with women equally with men so that they can together promote gender equality in decision-making process. That is why in the APNU, when we were approaching the extraction of MPs for the 12th Parliament, APNU was able to select a cohort that ensured absolute equality between males and females for the first time. Not 30% or 40%, but absolute equality, 50-50. Third, there must be some measure of protection and promotion of women's and girls' rights. That is at every level, at the home, at the school, at the workplace. We should ensure that women and girls have equal rights. And fourthly, there should be measures to prevent violence against women and girls. And unfortunately, we've seen in schools, we've seen in gangs, we've seen on the street, we've seen so many situations in which police confront so-called squatters, many of whom turn out to be women, but they don't use any um, gentle means, they use coercive means to try to bring about outcomes. And finally, the fifth pillar is that there must be some rigorous punishment of offenders who commit acts of violence. So when you're speaking about a national plan, there must be a revisiting to the principles of social cohesion, which must be deliberately promoted. It just can't happen. There must be participation in all institutions, political or social, cultural, the churches, the mandirs, the masjids, with women. Women and men must be able to participate in matters that affect decision making. Women must be protected. Women must be protected from violence, and offenders must be punished. What is the way forward? How do we protect our women? I mean, the record of 39 murders of women in 39 weeks is nothing to be proud of. It's shameful. And we need to examine carefully what means could be implemented right away, not waiting on some consultation, not waiting on some study. What measures could be implemented right away to protect our women? I predicted a few minutes ago that by the 31st of December, 52 women would have been killed. At the rate we are going, it's not a happy prediction. And we need to revisit at the level of central government, at the level of regional administrative councils, at the level of municipalities, at the level of neighborhoods, a policy of social cohesion. Social cohesion is not a foreign concept. It has come out of the Guyanese experience throughout the period of even colonial era. We saw situations in which at local government elections, women and men were able to sit down together to solve the problems of their communities. And the social cohesion, which was advanced by administration from 2015, is rooted in the common sense ability of the Guyanese people to sit down and work things out among themselves. There must be in the education a form of mainstreaming gender issues so that we teach equality. We teach equality and we treat students and children in schools equally. There must be a more rigorous enforcement of domestic violence laws. And the fact is that the police force is probably close to 80% made up of males. I don't know the exact percentage, but it is not 50-50. And certainly when you go to a police station or when a woman approaches a police station, particularly in a rural area, she's more likely to come up against a subordinate officer who's male rather than female. So we need to have laws enforced which support women's rights and protect women. And that is why when we speak of things like community policing or neighborhood policing, these aspects of policing are not ornamental. They mean that the divisional commander must go into these communities and relate to the residents of those communities to ensure that domestic violence issues are dealt with. In this way, they can start to enhance trust in the police force. And it is true that distrust of the police is a major factor in failure to curb domestic violence in Guyana. My friends, 39 murders of women in 39 weeks is nothing to be proud of. I know, and you know, that there are no easy answers to the question of violence, but we must make choices as policymakers, and we must ensure that change takes place in the way that males see females, that schools, offices, political parties, churches, the wider society all rise to the occasion and treat women as equals. This will bring to an end this quest for control and domination, which is at the root of all domestic violence. Women deserve to live in a safe society as equal citizens in Guyana. And this is what our policies must aim at. Thank you, and may God bless you.